Tonight we're going to take a look at the woman Ruth, a woman of great courage, of tremendous strength, of determination, and a woman of faith. But hopefully tonight we'll also see how this story of Ruth and of Naomi, whose stories are so joined together, and they're examples that have been recorded for us. Hopefully we'll see that their stories are much bigger than the confines of their day. The story of Ruth and Naomi is such an intense story of twists and turns. It's the kind of story that really just keeps you on the edge of your seat as you read through it. It's a true story of rags to riches, which we love, don't we? We love those stories. But the story is far bigger and more far-reaching, and the story reaches us. It includes us. It's a story of redemption, and it's a story that shows who and how God redeems. And what it highlights as we go through this and consider these things is just how different God thinks to how humans naturally think, how you and I think. If we were asked to sit down and to draw up a plan of redemption following the fall of man, and if we were asked to make a list of the types and the people who should be redeemed, of the key people who would be involved, then our story would be very different to the story brought out by these two women. And in fact, right throughout Scripture, that it shows us that. And it's probably a silly thought, because we would never, any of us, have the wisdom that God has, not even close. And so we would never be able to plan a story of redemption like God has. But the power of this story reveals to us that the sorts of people that man would put a line through, that society would cast off and society will write off, are the very ones that God has chosen to be right at the heart, right at the centre of his plan of redemption. And hopefully we'll see that the biggest story that's involved in these two women's lives. But just a bit of background. Last time, 2 weeks ago, we looked at this family living in the time of the judges in Bethlehem. People were pleasing themselves and not their God. And there was a famine in the land of Bethlehem. And this family decided to move to Moab. Moab was not a nice place. In many ways, they were the enemies of God and of Israel. In fact, in Deuteronomy 23, we read that the people from Moab were cut off. They weren't welcome in the land of Israel because of the sins that they'd committed, because of the evil that they'd shown to the people of Israel. So this family of Naomi, of Elimelech, with their 2 boys, they decide to move to Moab for a short time, to sojourn in Moab and to get some respite from the famine that was going on at the time. And here is where tragedy strikes Naomi and her life falls apart. First her husband dies, then her 2 boys marry wives from Moab, which would have been very hard to take. And then they die, and she's left alone in Moab with only 2 daughters-in-law from Moab. And we considered the bitter state of Naomi 2 weeks ago. She feels like God's hand is against her, and she feels empty. And she feels like God has taken everything that was precious to her. He's just taken it away from her. And she can't see, above all of the tragedy that she's experienced, on top of that, she can't see how her line is going to continue on in Israel, how Elimelech's name is going to continue on. She thinks that's the end for that name. The possession of the land would be given to someone else. This was the end for her family, essentially. And at this point, Naomi decides that she'll head back to her home in Bethlehem. She's heard that God has visited his people and he's provided them food again. The famine was over. But this didn't really lift Naomi's spirit as she returns home and she meets people who she hadn't seen for a very long time. She says, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. She says, "Call me Mara," which means bitter. As she starts journeying back to her home in Bethlehem, she decides that it's time to say goodbye to her 2 daughters-in-law from Moab. Her 2 much-loved daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And Naomi sees no future for them in Israel. She looks at the prospects that they have coming back to that land in Bethlehem, and she says, there's nothing there for you. And she pleads with these girls that they will stay in Moab, that they will make a life for themselves in Moab, that they'll get married in the land of Moab, because that's where their only future was, according to Naomi. That's all that she could see. And Orpah is eventually persuaded, but Ruth is not persuaded. And she makes an incredible promise to Naomi that she would return with her. And she says that where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And she says, where you die, Naomi, there I will die and will be buried with you. And this was a remarkable pledge of allegiance that Ruth gives to Naomi, to not only follow God, but also to be by Naomi's side. She says to Naomi, not only will I return with you and will I be with you, but even when you die, Naomi, I will remain in Bethlehem. At that point, I won't even return to my land. I will continue on living my life in Bethlehem. And then when I die, I will be buried with you in Bethlehem. That's what Ruth says to Naomi. This was not a sojourn that Ruth was making to Bethlehem. This was a permanent move. This was her conversion. This was Ruth's conversion. And it says that Ruth was steadfastly minded. She would not be convinced otherwise. She was determined. And it says that Naomi was silent. She couldn't utter a word. She saw the look on Ruth's face, and she couldn't even utter a word to this girl who was so remarkably determined. And this really is the first glimpse into the strength of this woman, Ruth. And it will keep coming out over and over again. But it's interesting just to stop and to consider what Ruth is doing here with her commitment to Naomi. I've got most of the verses up on the screen just for time's sake tonight, because it's a big story. But feel free to turn it up, but they will be on the screen. So we read this in Matthew 10, verse 37 to 39. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he that taketh not his cross, followeth after me, is not worthy of me. He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. Now, what a challenging verse that is. When I read that, I find that verse so challenging. And sometimes you think, gee, I fall so far short of that verse. But Ruth is the perfect example of this scripture, isn't she? She was willing in every sense to lose her life for the sake of following God and for the sake of being by the side of her mother-in-law, a widow who was fatherless. And in that sense, she absolutely loved God more than her earthly family in Moab. She gave up any hope, really, of salvaging a life for herself. Like Naomi said, there was such little hope for her going back to this land as someone being from Moab. But she didn't care. She went anyway. In James chapter 1, verse 27, we read that pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction and to keep himself unspotted from the world. So religion in its purest form is what is being demonstrated by Ruth. She was and it's almost like she goes above that, because she was promising more than just visiting the fatherless, wasn't she? This was more than a visit to Ruth. She was saying that I will be with you and I will not leave you forever. And the reason why it's such a pure form of religion, I believe, is because there's nothing that you receive back from that in this life. There's no return. This person has nothing that they could give you in return. They don't have the capacity to repay you. And Ruth knew that there was nothing that she would get back from this life. Naomi told her that. She was giving up her life to follow Naomi. And what an incredible example that is of dedication and commitment. And so they returned to Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth by her side. And as the women rush out to meet Naomi, who knew her many years ago, it's like they barely recognise her. So the strain of those preceding years was probably taking a toll. She'd probably aged quite a bit, and they struggled to recognise her. And Naomi says, please call me bitter, because verse 21 of chapter 1 She says, "I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me back home again empty. I am completely empty." And what Naomi couldn't see at this point was the blessing that was right beside her in Ruth. She couldn't see that the fullness of God's love was standing right next to her in Ruth, saying, "I will never leave you." God had not left Naomi. Not for one moment had God left her. Even though the tragedies and the very depths that she felt, God was there working with Naomi to bring about blessings in her future that she could never have imagined. And how often is that the case in our lives, where things happen to us, sometimes tragedies strike us, and we can't work out how or why God is working in a particular way. Sometimes we feel like God has deserted us, that we pray and it's like our prayers just aren't being heard. So why am I even praying? God's not hearing what I'm saying. But what we learn from Naomi is that even when we can't see it with our human eyesight, with our human brains, God is there. God is there working for our eternal good, working towards the most incredible blessings that will one day be revealed. God has not left us. Our lives involve many twists and turns, many ups and downs, many good decisions, bad decisions, times where we're spiritually strong, times where we're not spiritually strong. But the lesson is that God will abide with us as long as we abide with him. And so the final sentence of Ruth chapter 1 provides a glimmer of light in the darkness surrounding Naomi and Ruth. We read that, "And they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest." Now this would have been a great celebration, great time of celebration for the people of Bethlehem. After many years of going hungry, there was now food, and it was time to harvest this food. I don't know about you, but on a Sunday when I get home from the meeting, it's only been about 6 hours, but when I smell the food, it's just such great celebration that goes on, because finally you can eat again and that meal is just so good. But here, these people, it had been years of hunger, and finally God had provided food, and the celebrations that would have gone on would have been fantastic. But what were Naomi and Ruth going to do? They really had no one to look after them. They were both widows. And to Naomi's knowledge, there was no family member who could look after them. And they would have to make do themselves. They had no family and no food. And in this day and age, that was a very difficult position for people to be in. But they weren't without hope. On the scene comes Boaz in chapter 2. And we're introduced to another incredible character in this story. In verse 1, we read, "And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz." So here is Boaz, and it says he was a mighty man of wealth. Now that term, mighty man of wealth, is perhaps better translated a prominent man of noble character. A prominent man of noble character. He was a noble person, he was a good man, and he definitely had money. And that is exactly what you wanted in a kinsman. You wanted a close relative who was honest and who had wealth. There are two laws in this story that are central to everything that's going on. Two laws that were written about redemption. The first one is in Leviticus 25. Now this law here says, Leviticus 25 verse 48 to 49, we read, "After that he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brethren may redeem him, either his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him, or any that is nigh of kin unto him of his family may redeem him. Or if he is able, he may redeem himself." So we have this law here that states that it was the role of a family member, close relative, to redeem an individual who may have been, in this case, sold into slavery, or if someone had sold their land and they didn't have the means to buy that land back, then a near family member, a kinsman, could buy that for them that they could redeem them in that sense and they could get their land back. Or if someone fell into debt, again, that this kinsman could provide a helping hand in that situation. It was put there to look out for those who basically got themselves in a pickle, and there was this safety net for people in the law. Now there's a second law which is at play as well, which was in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 and 6, relating more to this seed that would carry on. So if brethren dwell together and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her and take her to him to wife and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. So if I was married and I passed away without children, then my name would come to an end. I would have no one to carry on my name. I'd have no one to pass my possession of the land on to, and it would go to someone else. And that is why Naomi is so distressed, because both her boys have died, and to her knowledge, there's no one who could preserve that seed of her husband and her two boys who had died. And that's why she says to Orpah and Ruth, she says, I'm too old to have another child, and even if I did, who is going to wait around long enough to marry this child that I have? So it was over, according to Naomi. So when we're introduced to Boaz in verse 1, this is potentially a game changer in the whole story for Naomi and Ruth. This changes everything, really. He was a near kinsman, a close relative who had lots of money. That was perfect. Couldn't be any better. And what I was thinking when I was reading this was, did Naomi know about Boaz? Was she aware of Boaz? It seems she is aware, because when someone brings up Boaz's name later in the story, she says, "Oh yeah, Boaz. I know Boaz. He's a near kinsman." But maybe it, like in her bitter state, in her distress that she was in, maybe she wasn't seeing clearly to consider the option of Boaz there as a redeemer for her and as a redeemer for Ruth. Or maybe, and I think this is probably a little bit more likely, maybe even if Boaz had crossed Naomi's mind, she may have thought, or she may have assumed, that even Boaz would never take it upon himself to marry a woman from Moab. Who was going to marry Ruth, this woman from Moab? And so even if she thought that Boaz was there as a near kinsman, he's not going to entertain the thought of marrying this widow from Moab. And I think that's why she really thought that it was a wasted thing for Ruth to come back to this land. There was really no future for her. No one was going to marry her. Because we know all about the history of the women from Moab, and that would have been very well known in the land. As I said last time, 24,000 people died on the day where the sons of God went and had relations with the women from Moab. That is not something that people forget. And here she is, this woman from Moab. But Boaz wasn't just another man. He was a God-fearing man. And we get a hint of that in verse 4. We read, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said unto his reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered him, The Lord bless thee." And we know that during the time of the judges, that this wasn't a time when people were generally God-fearing people. But here is this man, Boaz, who has involved God in his everyday life. And this looks like a ritual that Boaz would have done every day with his workers to bring up God at the start of the day. So we know that he is a God-fearing man. So verse 2, "And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said, Go, my daughter." So Ruth didn't waste any time. They had no food, they had no provider of food for them, but Ruth hadn't returned to piggyback off Naomi, had she? She hadn't just come back and she thought that Naomi was just going to look after her and take care of her. She took it upon herself to provide for Naomi, and she goes out to glean. And she would go out and she would glean in the fields after the reapers. And we know that in the law there was a provision for the poor where field owners would reap in their field, but they wouldn't go to the very corners of their field. And the intention is that the people who were poor, the people who didn't have fertile land for themselves, were lacking food, would come along and they would pick up the leftovers, the bits on the edges that hadn't been taken. And this was hard work. And I don't think it would have been a common sight for a woman to be out doing this job, not just because it was hard work, but because it was potentially very dangerous. This would have been very easy for Ruth to be taken advantage of out in these fields. And it's mentioned a couple of times in this story about the worry of Ruth's safety. She was very vulnerable going out and doing this. And it would have taken a lot of courage to do this. But there's no other option. And probably with the same steadfastness that Ruth had as she returned with Naomi from Moab, she now goes out with that determination to provide for her mother-in-law. And it just so happens that Ruth stumbles across the field of Boaz. That's how the author writes it. And I think as the author was penning those words, they probably had a wry smile on their face. It says, "And her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz. Or she just so happened to wind up in the fields of Boaz, the wealthy, godly, near kinsman of Elimelech." Now, of course, she didn't just happen to end up there. This wasn't random. This wasn't a fluke. It was no coincidence whatsoever. Just like everything that has happened in this story of Ruth to this point hasn't been a fluke and it hasn't been a coincidence. God is in control and he's going to ensure that these women are provided for. And it doesn't take long for Boaz to recognise, but it doesn't take long for Boaz to notice Ruth. He says in verse 5, he looks out to his field and he said, whose damsel is this? He looks and he sees this young girl who he's never seen before, and she suddenly showed up and she's hard at work, and he's immediately impressed. And in verse 6 we read, "And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, It is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab." Now, of course, everyone had heard about this widow from Moab who had returned with Naomi. It was all over the grapevine, I'm sure. News would have spread very, very quickly, especially in a small town like this. Whispers would have gone out so quickly. But here she was in the fields of Boaz, working harder than anyone else in that field. Verse 7 says, "So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house." The NET says, since she arrived, she's been working hard from this morning until now, except for resting in the sitting hut a short time. Boaz is incredibly impressed with Ruth, not only with the dedication that she had shown to Naomi, but now seeing the hard work and the determination firsthand. In verse 8 we read, Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not my daughter? Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not my daughter? Now let's just stop there for a second, because ever since Ruth has returned to Bethlehem, whenever Ruth has been mentioned, it's always been Ruth the Moabitess. It's repeated over and over. In verse 22 of chapter 1, it says Ruth the Moabitess. chapter 2, verse 2, and Ruth the Moabitess. Chapter 2, verse 6, it is the Moabitish damsel. It's repeated over and over, as if to emphasise that above all else, what people saw when they looked at Ruth, this incredible woman of faith, of determination, of strength, of courage, all people saw was that she was a Moabite. That's all she was. She was the woman from Moab. So, Boaz looks at this young girl on her hands and knees, working herself to exhaustion, and he sees so much more than where she was born. And it's hard to overemphasise this point. Boaz was no respecter of persons. Boaz is a type of Christ. And we know that Christ was no respecter of persons. He didn't care where someone was born. He didn't care what someone's background was. He looked straight through all of that stuff, and all he saw was someone's heart. When everyone else could see only a Moabitess, Boaz saw a daughter. And that's what he calls her. So why was it that Boaz could instantly see in this girl what others couldn't at this point? That this was someone who was so much more than just a Moabite? Well, Boaz, he had a pretty good role model in his father. We know from the lineage of Matthew that the father of Boaz was Salmon, who married Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute. That was Boaz's mother. Boaz had learnt from his father, who was no respecter of persons. He didn't write off Rahab because of where she was born, or because of the life of sin that she'd previously lived, or because of his reputation, of what other people would think of him marrying this woman who was a prostitute. He didn't care. He saw above all those things into the heart of this person in Rahab. And Boaz had learned that from his father and would now do the same with Ruth. Ruth, my daughter, how powerful is that? And we can see that this theme starting to emerge out of this book. These men, all of whom are written into the lineage of Christ, these men who were redeemers. They were men who would redeem. Boaz learnt that from his father. And then it would lead to Christ, the ultimate redeemer, who would redeem people of all backgrounds and who is our redeemer. And so it's so much more than just a good story. So Boaz instructs Ruth to stay in his field and to not go to another field. He was going to personally look after her, to provide for her and Naomi, and he takes her in really as a member of his own family. And Ruth is blown away. She can't believe this. The mercy that's been shown to her. In verse 10, we read that she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? I'm a stranger. Why are you even looking sideways at me, Boaz? Ruth cannot believe the mercy that this man has shown. Everywhere she's gone, she's been known as a Moabitess. Maybe people are going out of their way to avoid her. People looking in the other direction when she comes near. Hearing whispers as she walks past. But here is Boaz saying, Stay in my field and I will look after you. I will provide for you, Ruth. In verse 12, Boaz says to Ruth, The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Boaz had heard of the kindness of this woman that she had displayed to Naomi in her time of distress, and he prays for a blessing to be on her from God, under whose wings she was now under. And we'll just remember that phrase because we'll revisit that shortly. Now in verse 14 we read that Boaz, he brings her into his home and provides a meal for her, and he issues these instructions to his workers that she should be allowed to come and should be allowed to take grain freely from that field, that they should just drop some leftovers for her on purpose so that she might grab it. And whenever she gets thirsty, they were instructed to go and get her some water. So Boaz is going to look after this girl. In verse 17, we read, "So she gleaned in the field until even, and beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley." And an ephah of barley was about 30 pounds, or about 13 kilograms. And that was an awful lot of grain for someone to gather in a day. That was a lot of grain. From what I read, it was weeks and weeks worth of food in one day. That's what Ruth had been able to gather here in the fields. And so she makes this trip home. She's lugging not only this 13 kilos of grain on her back, she's also somehow got the leftovers from the feast that Boaz has just given her. And Naomi's at home and she's just waiting there anxiously, thinking, she's been forever, she's been gone all day. Has something happened to her? I should never have sent her into the field. Someone's taken advantage of her. I've lost my two boys, maybe I've lost Ruth. So all these things might have been going through her head. And then this knock on the door comes and Naomi rushes and she looks out and means she can't really see Ruth because all she sees is just like grain everywhere. She just sees almost like two eyes poking through all this grain that she's gathered, and she can't believe it. And then Ruth hands over the leftovers from her feast, and Naomi's just, her eyeballs are probably popping out of her head, just thinking, what has gone on here? Verse 19, "And her mother-in-law said unto her, Where hast thou gleaned today? And where wroughtest thou? Blessed be he that did take knowledge of thee." Naomi knew that someone had shown her an incredible amount of, favour for this to have happened. Because this clearly was more than anything that she could have expected. And then Ruth says that she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought and said, "The man's name with whom I wrought today was Boaz." And then Naomi's jaw probably just hits the table. Boaz. She can't believe what she's hearing. And it surely is starting to dawn on her at this point that someone else is at play in all of this. This couldn't just be an accident. This wasn't a coincidence. This woman, who had felt like God had deserted her, could now start to see his hand working in her life. What a feeling that must have been. Possibly the first time she'd felt that emotion of hope since the day her boys had passed. She sees hope, she sees the hand of God. Has that ever happened to us before, where we just think of things just lining up, one thing after another, after another, after another, and we think, wow, that just can't be a coincidence. And it's just an amazing feeling, isn't it, when you can just see the hand of God bringing things together and you think, that is not a coincidence. God is at work here in my life. And that's, I think, what Naomi is starting to feel. Suddenly there was hope. Not just hope for Naomi and Ruth, who now had this source of food, this one to look after them. Naomi could see that there was hope for the name of her husband and the name of her sons who had passed. She says in verse 20, Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead." And Naomi said unto her, "The man is near of kin unto us, one of our kinsmen." So not only does Naomi see God's hand in providing for the circumstances, the need for food of Naomi and Ruth, but she sees that her husband and her sons have not been forgotten either. They have not been forgotten. Blessed be he of the Lord, whom hath not left off his kindness to the living and the dead. He is a near kinsman, Ruth. And the significance of that would not have been lost on Naomi. All the possibilities would have been going through her head, racing through her head, and she instructs Ruth to continue in the field of Boaz. In verse 23, we read, "So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of barley harvest and of wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law." And so we come to, so we're just having to skim through now a little bit this story, and there's just so much in this story, but we'll just skim through. But we come to chapter 3, and it's time for action. Ruth has been spending day after day in the fields of Boaz, no doubt returning with lots and lots of food every day. And that's fantastic, but Naomi is no longer thinking about food. She's not thinking about food anymore. She's thinking about Boaz as the one to perform the role as kinsman redeemer. Not only to redeem Ruth, but to provide that seed, that precious seed to carry on the family name, someone who could inherit their portion of the land. The food was great, but it was time for seed. And Naomi sees a perfect opportunity to take this to the next level, to make it very clear to Boaz what they desperately needed from him. So she says to Ruth in verse 2 of chapter 3, "Tonight he winnoweth barley in the threshing floor." And this was a perfect opportunity to get Boaz alone. The threshing floor, I don't know a huge amount about the threshing floor, but apparently, I've read a few things, that's where they would bring the grain from the field, and that grain would be pressed down on the floor, like I think crushed. I don't know if people went and they stomped on it, or there was another means of crushing that grain. But it was this room that was situated in a particular spot in the field where apparently there would be a consistent wind that would pass through, because that's what they needed. So when they threw the grain, used to throw the grain up into the breeze, it would come through and it would sift that grain out, that barley. And that's where Boaz was this night. That's what he was going to be doing. And so Naomi says to Ruth, "Now is the time, get ready, have a shower, put on your best clothes." Here was the plan. The plan was that after Boaz had completed a long day of work, after he'd finished eating and drinking and had fallen down to sleep, Ruth was going to sneak into this room where he was. She was going to uncover his feet, and then she was going to lay down next to him and wait for Boaz to wake up and then see how he reacted. That was the plan. And it sounds quite strange. But that's what Ruth does. In verse 7, she heads in, and we read, "When Boaz had eaten and his heart was merry, he went to lay down to sleep. And in comes Ruth, just like Naomi said. She uncovers his feet, and then she lays down next to him. And she follows what Naomi had said to her. And you think, why does she do this? What's this uncovering of the feet? Well, it's supposed that by uncovering his feet, that wind that was blowing through, that cold breeze, would eventually make his feet very cold, and he would wake up because of the chilliness of his feet. That was the plan. And when he woke up, he would see Ruth. Ruth would be there. Just imagine Ruth lying there as she's done this, and he's fast asleep, and she's there just waiting, and her heart would have been pounding, and then you'd see, Boaz would just move a little bit, and your heart would skip a beat. Is he about to wake up and see me? It would have been very, very scary. This was an incredibly forthright thing that Ruth is doing. This whole chapter is essentially a marriage proposal to Boaz, and what Ruth was doing was to make it abundantly clear to Boaz exactly what she was asking from him. She would have no doubt have had plenty of fears of being rejected at this point. Is he just going to kick me out? I'm a Moabitess. I shouldn't be here. I'm a stranger. He's just going to wake up and kick me out. These thoughts no doubt would have been going through her head. So she's lying there waiting, and eventually he stirs and wakes up in verse 8, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he says, "Who art thou? Who are you, and what on earth are you doing here?" And Ruth answers, and she says, "I'm Ruth, thine handmaid." And she says, "Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman." Now that sounds very suggestive, but it's important to understand exactly what Ruth is saying. This was a proposal, and that term, "spread thy skirt over thy handmaid," it's interesting because that is the exact same phrase that Boaz had said to Ruth when he first met Ruth in the fields in chapter 2. Verse 12, this is what he said to Ruth: "The Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust." That's what Ruth now says to Boaz. Spread thy skirt also means spread thy wing over me. And it's used in Ezekiel 16 to describe God covering the nakedness of his people. Boaz had prayed that God would do that for Ruth. And Ruth now, what she's saying, I think, to Boaz is, she says, Boaz, if your prayer is that God will spread his wing over me, then I need you to do that. Then you are God's means of that wing being spread over me. I need you. You're the near kinsman, Boaz. There's no one else to perform this role. In verse 11, Boaz says, now my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requires. For all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. First, it was only Boaz who could see past the fact that she was a Moabitess. It was only Boaz. But now, as Boaz says, the whole town knows, they've seen firsthand the amazing things that you're doing, and the whole town knows that you are a virtuous woman. Now, that term is full of meaning, virtuous woman. The translation is a woman of noble character. And that word actually means a force, an army, wealth, virtue, valour and strength. And that's exactly what Ruth was, wasn't it? She was all those things. And when we think of some of those terms like force and army and valour and strength, it's probably not something that would immediately link to sort of a widow looking after her mother-in-law, caring and providing food for her mother. We might think of a fearless warrior on the battlefield going out and killing heaps of people, protecting his country, all of those things. But what this says about the characteristics of Ruth, and in fact what it says about the roles that a lot of faithful sisters perform, maybe a little more at times in the background, not at the forefront, not as prominent, where everyone can see, but they are every bit as powerful and mighty as a fearless warrior. And that is what Boaz is saying to Ruth. And what's also interesting is that it's the exact term that is used to describe Boaz himself. Back in verse 1 of chapter 2, we were told that Boaz was a mighty man of wealth, and that is translated a prominent man of noble character, the exact same word, virtuous. So what he could see in Ruth were the exact same characteristics that he possessed himself. And it's really, there's no time to go through this tonight, but Proverbs 31, where it says, who can find a virtuous woman, in verse 10, you'll see the rest of that chapter, there is reference after reference to Ruth. It's just over and over again to the story of Ruth. And so what we're being shown here is that she is the perfect example of this quality of virtue. She is a virtuous woman. So everything was working out perfectly, just the way that Naomi had planned. And as we read this, we think, perfect, great, now it's time to get on with it, time to get married, and then everything is going to work out perfectly. But of course, there's another twist, and because this story is full of twists and turns, and nobody sees this twist coming. In verse 12, we read, and now it is true that I am thy near kinsman, howbeit there's a kinsman nearer than I. Oh no. Boaz says, Ruth, I will definitely redeem you, but it's not my rightful place. There is one who's a closer relative that would first get the opportunity to perform that role. And can you imagine Ruth's heart just sinking, thinking, oh no, this wasn't meant to happen. Everything was going so perfectly. But now there's another man who has the right to redeem me. And so Boaz says, tomorrow we will call this man to see if he's willing to perform his rightful role. And so there's another twist in this story of ups and downs. So Ruth stays till very early, and then she returns to her home. And in verse 16, Naomi, who probably hasn't slept at all, she's so eager to hear how the plan went, how it all ended up. And she comes out and she says, who art thou, my daughter? Basically what Naomi is saying to her is, are you married? Has it all worked out? And she tells the story to Naomi, and Naomi just would have, oh no. So no one saw this coming. This was all going so perfectly. So the next day, this is in chapter 4, our reading for tonight, Boaz heads to the city gates, along with the elders of the city, and he meets this man who is this closer relative. And it's interesting that in this whole story of Ruth, all the characters involved are named. All of them are named. This is the only character who has no name in this whole story. He remains nameless the whole time. Boaz meets his close relative. He would have been well known to Boaz. And he says, "Ho, such a one. Ho, such a one." A really weird thing to say, really. It's like saying, "Hi there, you. Hi, you. How are you going? Hi, mister. How are you?" And then, so he comes to verse 3 and 4, and he makes this proposition to this man. He says to this man, "Naomi is selling her land, which belonged to our brother Elimelech, and because you are the closest relative," which we know from Leviticus 25, it would always fall first to the closer relative, "you get the first opportunity to redeem the land. But if you don't want to do that, then I will do it." And so this nameless man says, "Sure, absolutely, I will redeem the land." And we need to read between the lines a little bit here with what's going on. But what this nameless man sees is probably a great opportunity. Here's this land. There's no heir. There's Naomi. She's past the age of being able to give birth. There's going to be no seed that's going to inherit this land. So this land's going to come to me. And he says, "Fantastic." He says, "I will do it." But then Boaz, who has this ace up his sleeve, Boaz plays this very, very well. He says, "Okay, good." He says, "By the way, I may not have mentioned that when you redeem the land, you do realise that you also need to redeem Ruth, the Moabitess, and you need to raise up a name of the dead upon his." You need to marry Ruth. You need to provide a seed for Ruth, and that seed is going to get the land. And in verse 6, the kinsman said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar mine own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it." It says, "I can't redeem it." So this nameless person who was so keen to protect his inheritance and also keen to protect his name would not put himself in a position where he would marry a woman from Moab. He did not want to be known as the man who had married a woman from Moab. He was worried about how that would reflect on him. From a business perspective, the land would be given away anyway, so it wasn't a good decision. And it's ironic that this man was so worried about protecting his name, and he is the only nameless person in the whole story. And then if you go to Matthew chapter 1, who do you have there in the very lineage of Christ? Boaz, the man who redeemed this woman from Moab. There was Boaz. And here is this man so worried about his reputation, so worried about his life now, he remains nameless. No one knows his name. And so we read this story unfold. We all breathe a sigh of relief because this crisis has been averted, and Boaz gets Ruth. And finally the story is complete. Verse 13, we read a beautiful ending to this story of twists and turns. We read, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the woman said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee as a restorer of life, and a nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. And Naomi took the child, and laid it in her bosom, and became nurse unto it." So what a beautiful ending to an incredible story. Finally, it's complete, with Naomi nursing this baby from Ruth, the restorer of life, a daughter who was better than 7 sons. Isn't it amazing how God works in a person's life? What an amazing story that is, and a story that is far bigger than just a story about a seed of Naomi to carry on their family name. It's far, far bigger than that. God was using these women who most of society would cut off. Naomi, who had written herself off. Ruth, who was known as the woman from Moab. That's all she was. And then she's dismissed by this man who remains nameless in order to protect his own reputation. But God would use these women to perform a purpose much greater than that. The seed provided for Naomi was not just any seed. He would be the grandfather to King David, one of the greatest kings in Israel's history, a man after God's own heart. But then from him would come even a greater seed, a seed to take away the sins of the world, born in a manger, probably very, very close in proximity to where Naomi was now nursing her grandson. Isn't that beautiful? God is incredible and he works in incredible ways. And at times when we can't see his hand working in our lives, when we face trouble, sadness, anxiety, depression, loneliness, hopelessness, bitterness, let's remember the story of Naomi and Ruth. When we can't see the hand of God in our lives, when it looks like there are dead ends everywhere, let's trust the Almighty that he has a bigger, a much grander future that he is working us towards, greater than any of us could possibly imagine. If we feel that we are the sort of people who are beyond saving, let's look at the characters that God continually chooses to reveal his glory in and his grace towards. Sinners, many with no standing in society, many who society would want to have nothing to do with. And finally, just the final note to end, God has chosen the story of Ruth and Naomi, and he has woven this into his greater plan of redemption. I've referenced Matthew 1, we won't turn there, but there in Matthew 1 we have a lineage of 42 generations leading to the birth of God's Son, God's only Son. And within those 42 generations there were 5 women named, just 5 women. Let's look at those names. I find this absolutely incredible. These are the 5 women. We have Tamar, who dressed as a prostitute and tricked her father-in-law into sleeping with her. We have Rahab, a prostitute from Jericho. We have Ruth, a widow from Moab, the enemies of Israel. We have Bathsheba, who committed adultery with King David. We have Mary, who was suspected of committing adultery. What this shows us is that God will take individuals whose society has dismissed, whose society has cut off, and he has weaved these individuals into his greater plan of redemption involving his Son, the true kinsman redeemer, the Son of God, born in humble conditions, born in our very flesh, our own nature, making him a rightful redeemer as our near kinsman. Only it cost him more than a sum of money to redeem us. It would cost him his life. This story is about God's redeeming work throughout all of history, and because of that, we've not been left nameless. We who were strangers, metaphorically, in the outskirts of someone else's field, grabbing the leftovers. We who were once strangers have not had our names written off. We are not nameless, but we've had our names written into the book of life next to these faithful women in Ruth and Naomi.